Okay, finally. Now let me check to make sure that everybody, Josh, has got notes on where we're at here. One second, buddy.
Sure, take your time.
All right. Well, good. Let me get logged in over here so I can watch some questions. Yep, I hear people logging in. Okay, if you guys are, whoever's watching, you should have the opportunity to submit any questions that you want, and we'll get around to those as we get an opportunity to. If you'll give me just a moment, let me log in so I can monitor it from here. After we've created 3 Hangouts just to hold one. All right. Well, so not sure who all we've got on, but it's recording, and if people are not able to get on, then we can figure out so they can. Well, we'll have it recorded and they can get on later. Give me just 1 second here and let me put one more link. Okay, and everybody got people saying it's working through YouTube.
Oh,
okay. We're gonna go ahead and get started. So, thanks, man. I appreciate your patience. It's kind of I told for those of you who are watching, I told Josh earlier that the charismatic in me wants to blame the technical difficulties on Satan, but that's kind of crazy. So we won't do that. So I appreciate Josh being willing to come and spend some time, an elongated amount of time now, since we've spent a good bit of time publicizing this thing and then having to set up all the technical challenges that we've had. So we'll get started. Josh, I've just got just a series of questions that we want to work through. And first of all, I want to thank you for taking the time, and we wish Ashley could be here as well. You said, I think we talked last night, Josh, you and I did, you said she's traveling right now and not able to be with us.
Yeah, and she's, so we had different roles here in the research project. So when we started this, she was an undergraduate at the University of Northern Colorado, where I'm a professor in the sociology department, and she's moved on now. She's getting her PhD at Vanderbilt, and she still has interest in religion, but I think more so her interests have veered into health and community studies. And so she did a lot of the initial data collection on this project and some of the early rounds of data analysis, and then so I did the writing of the manuscript and sort of guiding the overall project. So you'll hear me, and there have been some other graduate assistants that have played minor roles, but nothing like her. I mean, she was a co-author in the academic sense for sure.
Yeah, maybe just since we don't have her here with us, but she's her name's on the book, and if you guys don't have it yet, obviously Church of Refugees, pick it up on Amazon. You're looking at about 142 pages, and probably, depending on how fast you read, maybe an 8 to 12 hour read. So kind of tell us a little bit, Josh, about how the project started. Maybe also explain Ashley's involvement. You give her a whole lot of credit, obviously, in the book, and evidently she's been one of the most magnificent research assistants around. So kind of give us the backstory, Josh, on how you guys met, how this project was born, how it came about, and I'll have a few more questions to kind of tease that out.
Sure. So it's really hard to sort of we had very sort of defined roles here, but it's hard to give her too much credit because the project wouldn't have happened without her. I teach a regular class called Sociology of Religion. We sort of dive into the themes that are common to religions across societies, across time. The dynamics that any group of people getting together to try and do religion face and that kind of stuff. And since that's my research area, I tell students, there's always ongoing research. If you have any interest in being involved, University of Northern Colorado, we're a teaching university. That's our primary job, and we see involving students in the research process as a big part of what we do. And so I make that invitation in my classes, and Ashley took me up on it. And normally when this happens, I did the same thing to Ashley that I do to my other students. I give them some relatively small task, and they go away and they never do it. And nobody's wasted any time. They just, there's no harm, no foul, right? But Ashley came back a week later. She had done everything I'd asked her to do. She had done more. She had gone looking for other resources and da-da-da. And so I was like, oh, okay, this is going to be a real thing. And the term de-churched had come up for me in my original research for my dissertation, but ultimately it wasn't what I was interested in at the time. And I just sort of put it in my back pocket, and I thought, well, I'll come back to this someday. And that ended up being the day that we came back to it. And as we originally set out to try and understand sort of how people move through religious careers, but we honed in pretty quickly on this one aspect of people's experiences that really we felt like there was something sociologically interesting going on. And then the deeper that we got into it, the more we realized that this deserved a broader audience than just academics. Wow.
Okay. So with that kind of as the background, let's kind of zoom out a little bit more, Josh, and maybe help the people who are watching and the people who will watch afterwards via YouTube, help us connect to you guys personally. Give us a little bit of background about yourselves personally, family, your church background. Kind of paint a backdrop so we can have something. It's so easy for people to look at a book, look at an author, and have some critical things to say before they even get to know the authors personally. And that's why I like doing these kind of interviews, at least by phone. This is the first one I've been able to do by video. But I think that backdrop is significant so that we understand who you are and as a brother in Christ, and who actually is as a sister in Christ.
Yeah, so I'm glad that we have the opportunity to do that. I mean, it's not something as an academic that I'm used to doing, but I've learned how powerful the being able to understand something about who's writing the book can be. Ashley and I are fond of describing ourselves as sociologists of religion and religious sociologists, and so we're really trying to walk that line in this book and with this research. We want to present things that we think as academics and as researchers and scientists are true and that we know to be accurate and factual, but we don't want to overstep those boundaries into telling people how they should run their churches, because we don't run churches. We do both go to church. Ashley's husband's actually a worship pastor. They've been married now for a few years and live in Nashville. I say a few years. I feel like it was right before, shortly before we met, that she and her husband got married. And I wouldn't say I was raised in the church, but I started going to get confirmed in a Lutheran ELCA church when I was in middle school, and then I've been a churchgoer more or less ever since then. But I mean, like many people, there have been times when nothing fit, when my life didn't fit into church, and then when I wanted a church, there wasn't a church that fit into my life. We lived in Nashville for graduate school. We bounced around. My wife and I bounced around a little bit in our early 20s as we were trying to figure out, how to get the timing right with her. She has a master's degree in therapeutic recreation, works with people who have disabilities, and so we were trying to get that all worked out. She went to the University of Georgia, and I was in Nashville, and moved to Texas and then to here, where we actually have a great church here that we really like going to. That is our community in the very real sense of the word, or at least it's a big part of what our community is. We're fortunate enough to have a very diverse community in terms of where it comes from.
Okay, so paint that backdrop for us. What denomination are you in? A mainline denomination, or where are you now?
No, I'm not opposed to mainline denomination. When we couldn't figure out a way that we could attend church with any integrity for the two of us, where my wife was going to be treated as a second-class citizen, for lack of a better word, or not as an equal to me. And so she's an elder in our church. It's non-denominational. Mainline denominations would have provided the same kind of thing. We didn't find one that we liked. This is actually our church here that we go to is run by run is a weird word. There's only like 75 to 100 of us, so it's not really like we can't pay anybody enough to run the thing. But the guy who started it and who preaches, he doesn't even preach most Sundays now because we're in this season where we're trying to build up new leaders. Anyway, he's a philosopher. He's an adjunct philosopher at our university, Jeff Cook. You maybe have read some of this stuff on Patheos, on not Brian McLaren, excuse me, Scott McKnight's blog. And so Jeff and I are good friends, and so we started going to the church. It's been around now. It's one of these weird ducks in the religious landscape statistically, so it's relatively small, but it's been around now for I think 12 years, which makes it pretty rare for church. But it's great. So it's I like my church because we have a lot of people that do a lot of different things, and Sunday mornings ends up often being a really important time for me personally, but maybe not necessarily for everybody else. And often it's the smallest chunk of time that we spend each week in the building is doing Sunday morning worship because we have a coffee shop attached to it. We're having meetings there. I do a lot of work. I wrote this whole book from the coffee shop in the church. So we're in and out of it a lot, and it becomes a sort of community hub for us, and that's been really good for both people who go to our church, but also more importantly for people who don't go to our church because it has the best coffee in town, and maybe the best coffee in the world, and so we end up getting a lot of people from the city that way. Okay, so you wrote the book from the coffee shop, and the research that came prior to writing the book, were you in that local church there while the research was going on, and you were testing your hypotheses and drawing conclusions? I was, but we were so happy to find the place that we found and to be a part of this community that we made a pretty intentional decision early on not to do any interviews with the people that I actually go to church with. It just didn't see. I had no interest in sitting there on a Sunday morning or being at somebody's house for dinner and having them think that I was taking notes secretly every time I went to the bathroom, or going home and like typing up field notes or anything. And my church isn't that kind of church anyway. I mean, we have a lot of college students, so we transition probably about half of our members, for lack of a better word, every year. They either graduate or they do whatever college students do. So therefore we end up with a lot of nuns and duns and people that are just in weird liminal space. But I just really didn't want to have that part of my brain on when I was at church, and so we were looking for other sources for data. That sort of answers the question I had for you, which was how has the research affected your own participation, your own involvement in your own local church? I know you may not be able to speak for Ashley, but perhaps there were conversations in which she may have expressed how that research affected. So I got to imagine, having been a church leader and a pastor in various capacities in different states, for the last 25 years, different denominations. I mean, what you write about, what you speak on, what you study, I mean, it affects your viewpoint on things. So, just personally speaking, how did your research and some of the findings affect you guys as authors personally within the context of the local church where you guys were attending? Yeah, well, without speaking too much for Ashley, I'll say that I know it was a big part of their consideration as they were searching for, as her husband was searching for a new job when they moved to Nashville so she could start her PhD program. And as they were thinking about, and even now as they think about what his role there should be and is, and how much of their life to center around that building. Which is a tricky position, when you're on staff and it's part of your community. For me, it was, I got I have a tendency in my personality to dive headlong into things. And as we have decided pretty firmly that we love being in Greeley and we would like to stay here for, as long as Greeley will have us, that we just very much informed by the kinds of things that I was hearing from people who have been so involved in the church, and then, not because I felt burnt out, but because I felt stifled. My wife and I don't want to say I, because that's not true. My wife and I made a real decision to take it slow. And as you know, when you poke your head up, and many churches, especially small churches, when you poke your head up above the sand, they'll grab you and they'll stick you in any position that they can possibly stick you in if they think that you're remotely fit or capable for doing it. And so my wife and I are both involved. Like I said, she's an elder. That just happened this spring. I've been on management team, which is a really good role for me. So I get to do all this. I get to exercise all the sort of organizational, knowledge that I have. But we ultimately make recommendations. We don't actually have any decision-making power, which is really good because that would have people, I know some things, that's for sure, but I don't know that I know more about my local congregation than anybody else, and I certainly don't want my credentials to, make it seem like I do. So it's really good for my power there to be structurally limited. I like that. I think it's a good match for us, and it seems like a sustainable amount of involvement.
Awesome. Okay. Well, so let me get into kind of some of the meat of the things that struck me as I was reading, and I have a few questions. So you mentioned that your starting hypothesis was kind of the dominance, is what I wrote down, was the dominance of conservative Christian theology and poor behavior of church leadership with levels of moral corruption. But these turned out not to be true, you said. And so describe for us, if you can, the process through which this realization started to dawn on you that the hypothesis that you started with wasn't true. Was there a particular aha moment, or did it just happen over the course of, a few weeks or months, or maybe you can kind of tease that out for us?
So I think we explained in the book that we used chain referral sampling. So we're going from person to person to person here. And really the first, when you do something like that with a group that is not very well defined or not known very well, I would guess that probably the first 10 to 12 interviews that you do are really just sort of you mucking around. I mean, you've got an interview guide and you've got reasons for asking all the questions that you've asked, just like we did. They were all matched to theories that existed in the scientific literature that we're sort of testing. But those first, I don't know that we actually ended up using any of the data from the first dozen interviews because we weren't very clear about what we were asking yet, and people weren't very clear about their stories and identifying the right sort of chain referrals. After that, it starts to click in, and we begin to sort of cross things off of our list, like, okay, that's not a thing, that's not a thing, that's not a thing, while other things emerge, and that's sort of the process here is the reflexive process. So as we're doing those initial interviews, we're then transcribing them and analyzing, especially those early ones, as we're going to try and hone in on something here. And I always say, I tell my students, I say, you have a good research project when all of your initial hypotheses end up being wrong. Because, you have hypotheses for a reason. It's because they come from the literature, and if the scientific community is saying here's something that should happen, and you go out and test it, and in fact it happens, well, that's great, and you can write that up, and that we would have done that, and we thought we were going to do that, and we would have put it in a journal article, and it would have been fine, and we wouldn't be doing this, and nobody would we wouldn't have written this book or anything. But if you're wrong, and you're consistently wrong in the same way, then what that means is that you're onto something, and the rest of the scientific community is not onto it yet. And I think in the field of the sociology of religion, I think we've done a particularly terrible job of accounting for the vast array of religious experiences that are out there. I mean, it's just within the last few decades. I think it was like 50 years ago that there was a book written called Protestant Christian Jew, and those were your only three choices on the survey. For affiliation, and even as we get nuns added to that in the 1960s, about 1970s, that still is not nearly good enough, I don't think. And so that's really sort of where we wedged our elbows into the scientific world and said, we got to get better at this. And Ashley and I think that when we talk to academics, that's the point that we make is you can care about the duns, and we can that's like a pebble into the ocean. For what it means in terms of the sociological realm. But the boulder that we want to tip over the side is to say, you need to make space for there's a lot more than we currently know about the ways that people are doing religion and experiencing religion in the world. And this book is proof of that. Yeah,
I think I would consider myself at this point as one of the duns. And so it was interesting, reading it and kind of participating in the research and participating in the results of the research anyway, participating in the stories that were there. I mean, it's really fascinating how, and I'm sure you guys interviewed, about 100 folks, and we just got the tip of the iceberg in the book. And I think so many people can identify as well, and we've seen that on Facebook and Twitter and whatnot, just story after story after story. It's like, yeah, that's me. Yeah, I struggle with that. Yeah, I've been there before, and yet I've never met these people. I don't know what kind of, denominational background they have. I don't know what kind of religious upbringing they had, but I think it's fascinating to see just how widespread this thing is. And so that's, let me kind of drill down a little bit to, and by the way, I just wanted to say, before I get into my questions about some of the statistics you have, page 142, I love that you said, we have a commitment to data, not an agenda. And I appreciate that a lot. It's very rare to find books that are committed to facts rather than a particular agenda, a particular angle, a particular marketing effort or whatever. And so it was very refreshing reading the data just for what it was. So here's my questions. Getting all kind of beeps. I guess people are lots more people are joining in here. So the question I have for you is that regarding the statistical data that you provided about your respondents. On page 10, for example, we see the average household income is about $55,700. The average age is 40 years old with a spread from 18 to 84. 56% female, 92% white. From page 22, they're financially stable people. 77% of those over 25 report household incomes over 65 grand. Very likely to be married. 77% of the sample are over the age of 25 are married. Substantially higher levels of education than church-going population in general. 15% of affiliated Christian population have a college degree. The average respondent in the book completed some grad level, and 80% are either currently enrolled in college or completed undergrad. So here's my question.
Okay.
I read that and I see basically, middle class, largely female, white, well-to-do, reasonably educated. So you mentioned in your book that you did not want to exclude the poor, yet the average household income in the respondents seems high enough to indicate that maybe just a few poor people were interviewed. Is that true? I mean, talk to me about the inclusion of the poor and also of those who are not white.
Yeah, good questions. Okay, so a couple things to understand about those statistics first, or the one big important thing to understand about that first is that it's a qualitative study. So I wanted to give some sense of who our respondents were, but we shouldn't take from that and extrapolate to the population of the United States. That we would need a survey, a nationally representative or a quota sample survey, which we've got coming out. After this book was done, the publisher of the book, turned around and commissioned us to do that survey. Now, when I say us, it's a different us. It's not a me and Ashley us. I actually also run a research lab at the university, right. And so we ended up doing that. But I'll say that the demographics fit pretty well, except that when we did the national survey, what shifted is that it ended up being a little bit more diverse among the Duns. And this is what's going to be super interesting is that we also we surveyed people who were almost done, who said that they were still in church but had one foot out the door. And those people ended up being a lot more theologically conservative and a lot more racially diverse, which would indicate that this is a problem. I mean, I don't want to say problem, because if you're a church insider, if you're a person who's invested in the institutional church, then this is a problem for evangelical and conservative churches, some of whom have argued that it's not their problem. Right. Coming for them also. So in regards to our book, I think there's some important ways to understand those data, and I believe in them. I think that we didn't interview poor people because I don't think that this is largely a poor person issue. And it's not because the poor are too dumb to get it, or because they just don't have a sophisticated understanding of church. I don't think that's it at all. I think that there's a certain amount of luxury that you have to have in order to pour this much time and effort and energy in your church and to want to continue to do that kind of work and to be able to continue to do that kind of work even outside of the institution. And when we look at those people, like who is actually structurally situated to be able to do work without institutional supports, well, then you're back to the privileged members of your society. People who are middle class or better with lots of education. In the United States, of course, that tends to be white. The 56% female, that doesn't bother me. I mean, the population is like 52% female, so we're off by just a little bit there. In fact, when we did the national survey, we used gender as one of our quota questions because it seemed to be so close, so dead on, that gender wasn't really playing a role here. And so, yeah, I think that our numbers, I mean, I know our profile is accurate of the people that we interviewed, but I don't see anything particularly alarming there. What the point we were trying to get across with all of that is that the people that are walking out and walking away, these are the people that they can get stuff done. And what's happened now in the United States in 2015 is that they don't need the church to do that stuff anymore. So maybe some of them were sticking around in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s who would have liked to have walked out, but then they thought, like, well, where will I get my community, or how will I be involved in making a difference in people's lives? And now we've got a world where everybody's incredibly connected, and getting things done together is easier than probably it's ever been. And where the church once had a monopoly on those things, it does not have a monopoly on organization anymore.
Yeah, I think in my experience, I've led and or pastored in 7 churches the last 25 years, and the demographics alone in every one of them were very much the same. There were a few black people, there were a few Latinos, but largely they were white, middle class. The poor would come occasionally. And of course, it was always an exciting moment, when we were reaching the poor, because they would come, but they wouldn't stick around. And typically, if you have a ministry like some churches may, like a Celebrate Recovery or an AA or something that would attract some of the poor in the community, they would tend to come and still be sort of segregated from the rest of the group, and still not really get deeply embedded and involved and volunteer for a lot of these organizations. So I hear where you're coming from. The thing that's kind of throwing me a little bit, though, is you say on page 11, white people generally have more social and cultural capital than other groups. So As you unfold your thoughts on the African-American community, what are your thoughts on having another set of research specifically focused on that community? Because that seems like, go ahead.
No, that's a great question. So part of chain referral or snowball sampling says that you'll get accurate data as long as you start your snowballs in diverse locations. And at a point, Ashley and I actually had a conversation about whether we should intentionally go after African Americans in the United States, and we decided against that. And here's why. As we dug into as we talked to more of our colleagues and peers, and as we dug into the research about it, we sort of knew this all along, but it was confirmed for us that the black church in America plays a much different role for that community than it does for the white church. If we would have done that, we would have wanted to get at least 25 or 30 interviews, almost like its own research study, and made it its whole separate chapter. So I think you're right that it's deserving of its own investigation. That it wasn't something that we didn't want to toss, we didn't want to get 4 or 5 interviews and toss that in with the rest of the data, because it would have obscured what is really important about those experiences by the mountain of data that would have been sort of just trampling all over it.
And to be fair, I mean, it's a scientific project. And so when you pick a method, you really can't deviate too far, or else it kind of screws up, the lab results. So I don't pretend to know how you do that, but in the end, I am familiar. You got to pick a hypothesis, and you got to pick a way you're going to do your research, and you got to stick with it. So I get that. One thing I did wonder, just thinking about it, and I thought a lot about this, and I wanted to throw this at you. That's been kind of mulling around in my mind the last couple of weeks. Not only the black community issue, because that church is completely different for them than it is for middle class white folks. But I wonder how much, Josh, personality plays into this. I wonder what it would look like, what the results would be if all 100 of the respondents were to take a DISC assessment or a Briggs-Meyer profile. I wonder, do you think in your research, you're just trying to take a guesstimate here, and just, you just throw something out here. Do you think that there's any, if you were to start a hypothesis on another set of research, do you think that what would your hypothesis be with regards to the common denominator of personality in all of these people who would call themselves duns?
So I can never remember what, the type 1. I'm a sociologist, not a psychologist, right? So I can never keep all that stuff from undergrad straight. Who can remember anything they were taught in undergrad? So the personality trait that like sticks out most to me is one of people that would rather get things done than be right. So in other words, like there's not there. My dad would say these are not touchy-feely people. Like there's not, in general, there's not a need to come together and pour your heart out until we all get on the same page and then move together, move forward together as one. This is a group that would just, in general, rather see stuff happen, moving towards or following after what they believe is God's calling in their life. And if there's some pieces to pick up or some messiness to deal with, then they're more than willing to sort of deal with that messiness and pick it up, and they would like to do it together. But that ultimately they're trying to live out the project of their religion in this world. And when the church stops being helpful for that, they leave it.
Yeah, that's good. It's a good way to describe it. I mean, it would seem to be at least the only stories we have access to, of course, are in the book. By the way, is there another place where somebody can find online, all of the interviews that you guys did? Is that available anywhere?
No. So we've got a lot of, so the interviews are all confidential. So we actually can't do that because there's some identifying information in there and stuff like that. It's all protected by the university's IRB. But there are lots and lots of stories. I would say that the stuff that I haven't seen too much that's happening online that's not pretty much a mirror of what we found. Okay. So if you interact with Wayne Jacobson's stuff at any level, those are stories that are real similar to what we found. If you're familiar with David Hayward and the work that he does as the naked pastor, like those are things that we're hearing pretty commonly. So it's funny. This has been in lots of blogs and lots of people have picked up on this, and it ends up being this thing where a normal blog post where somebody will get 10 or 15 or 20 comments and they'll chug along, and you can almost always pick out the one that's about church refugees, because that one will have like 185 comments. We get sort of bombarded in a good way by people's stories, and I've been pleased to see that the anecdotal evidence is matching up with the scientific evidence, so that we weren't sort of systematically making, just getting the same population over and over again. Yeah. So if you're finding that stuff out there, those are real similar to the stuff that we're hearing.
Yeah. Yeah, because I started pondering, it's easy for people to make the accusation, and they have before, to me personally, and it's funny because God's kind of teaching me a lot of humility here in these days, because I used to be the one making the comments as a pastor to the people who are in my position now, and having, well, they're just not committed, or they don't understand, or, all these list of reasons that we can provide that are supposedly biblical or theological or ministerial or whatever to explain why they're done with things. And so now I'm on this side of the fence, and I'm sitting back thinking, I kind of know my personality. I'm an ENFJ on the Briggs-Meyer scale. I don't know what I am on the DISC. I think, on that whole animal psychology thing, I'm like a golden retriever or beaver kind of thing. And there's all these different ways of describing us. And I wonder, is there a personality trait that's a strain underneath all of us, that would connect us all? And you know what? That's my analytical brain running. There probably isn't. I bet we're all just as different as can be. But just my mind trying to connect the dots. Is there something, that we're not seeing as duns? Right. I don't know, man. It's just kind of a weird place to be. So.
No, that's a great question. I wish we had thought of that at the beginning, because it would have been easy enough to sort of administer a moderated version of one of those instruments. But again, that's a sociologist to me that doesn't even think about that at the beginning.
Yeah, that's cool. We got, Church of Refugees 2.0, in a couple of years. We can
It's really it's one of the things you mentioned that we have a commitment to data, not to agenda, and I think one of the things that has allowed me to sleep at night and have a lot of peace around this project is that I have a really good job. Ashley's in a great PhD program. I have a good job that I like very much. I'm not actively writing another book. Like if there's a sequel or something that comes out of this, then that'll come because it comes because of an idea like that. We did this book. We did the soundtrack for the book, which we can talk about if you want. Those are the kinds of projects that I'm interested in, and it's not like we're not trying to put food on the table with this book.
All right, so yeah, you mentioned the soundtrack. I just heard about it a couple of days ago. I haven't even actually downloaded it yet. So so this is a spin-off project. Tell us a little bit about that and how it came to be, and what you hope that people can gain from it.
Yeah, so academics do not normally put out soundtracks for their work. That's a really weird thing to do.
Church Refugees, the soundtrack album, is that what it is?
That's exactly what it is, yes. Anybody who's interested, you can either search for Church Refugees on bandcamp.com. You can go to dchurch.net, it's there. You can send me an email. You can get it. So what makes it even weirder is that my wife and I are not musicians. So not only is this not an academic thing, but we're also not musicians. Ashley and I kept hearing over and over again in the interviews that people missed a sense of community that they sort of had when church was going well. And I thought, okay, that's too big. I can't figure that out right now. I think I've been hearing from some voices in the last few weeks that we might, that are interested in sort of helping think through what that might look like. And the other thing that they missed really was that there were no resources for them because everything spoke to the mainstream experience and not to their experience. And music was a big part of that. And I thought, okay, well, I can do something about this. We happen to know a lot of musicians who are Christians also, and some of them explicitly identify as Christian musicians. And so what we did is we took chapters from the book. We sent it out to about 6 of our friends and said, hey, would you mind taking read through the chapter and take ideally take some of the quotes from the people and use them as lyrics to seed a song. And my wife, the promise that we made to them, my wife and I said, because a couple of them are professional musicians, at least 2 or 3 of them, we said, we'll pay for production. So it'll sound like an actual thing, not just, recorded on your iPhone. And so it's one of the things I'm most proud of. The songs are great. We've got lyrics up for all of them. And it was a way that we were able to give back to the people that had spent an hour and a half, 2 hours of their lives sometimes talking with us on the phone, to say, look, here's an album that hopefully speaks to you and you can identify with, and that's songs that maybe you're not going to be singing them the next time you go to church, but that will provide some sort of identification.
Yeah, and where can we find that again? You said Bandcamp.
So it's at there's a number of places the album is for sale on Bandcamp. It's only $5. We're just trying to cover production costs, or you can go to dchurch.net. And there's a link. There's a tab there for the soundtrack. Okay,
excellent. I hear that these sound bites, these sounds going off while you and I are talking. Are you getting questions on your end? Because I'm watching here and I'm not getting any questions.
Oh, sorry. No, I'm not.
Okay. Well, maybe the sounds are people just coming in and joining in. And if you are, welcome. Glad to have you a part of this. You mentioned on page 8 that your research is peer reviewed. Is there a place online that aggregates journal articles with other links for us to go and review so we can see how your peers relate to your work and their thoughts on it?
Yeah, so we've got So the short answer to that question right now is no. Google Scholar is the place where we primarily get that. And one of the reasons why we wrote the book through a trade publication as opposed to going through an academic press is because it takes so long.
Right.
So here's the parts that have been peer reviewed and are in the process of being peer reviewed. The research was supported by a couple, maybe 3 internal grants at the University of Northern Colorado, and all of that goes through a rigorous peer review process. The research has been presented at several academic conferences. If anybody wants to nerd out with me at the Sociology of Religion conference in Chicago in August, I'll be happy to talk with you. Or at the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion in Los Angeles later this fall, I'll be happy to nerd out with you there. We'll be presenting data. We've already presented data from this project. We'll be presenting more data from this project at those conferences and probably for conferences to come. And then we've got one article that's currently under review that's moving through, moving through the regular stages. I don't see any reason why it's going to get, hung up. And that should, I don't know, we submitted that in January. It's under review. It'll probably come out next spring.
Okay. All right. You still with me?
Yeah, no, I'm there. Somebody just over in the questions. Somebody just posted the link to the Church Refugee soundtrack, which is great.
Awesome. Not sure who that was, but you rock. Thank you. Let's see here. Another question for you. It would be easy for the Duns to kind of categorize your book as a piece of research supporting their personal choices, in their current circumstances, and so. It'd be very easy for them to pick it up and use it as a support system to kind of justify their own current situation or their own feelings. So, but you guys, you and Ashley, you guys aren't categorizing yourselves as one of the Duns. So, maybe you could just kind of speak to that. I think it's good for as an author for you to have a chance to say, to the Duns, hey, I understand what you're going through, but don't use my book as a way to, vent out all your frustrations, and you know what I'm saying. It could be easy for them to use your book as a bully club. So
yeah, I suppose. And this gets us into a little bit of that question that you asked about what, and that we've been alluding to about sort of why do this? I mean, as academics, like we don't look. It's a bigger sell for me among my academic peers to convince them that there's real sociology in this book than it is the other way around. So my colleagues are inclined to sort of, on the face of it, dismiss a project like this because it doesn't go through the traditional, system, even though it's, like I said, that research is currently working its way through the traditional system. We just felt like the information was so important that we wanted to get it out there. We wanted to start a conversation. So if people identify with the book, if the Duns identify with the book, then I would say great. That means we've done our job. That makes me feel really good. What I don't think is particularly helpful, and although I understand it, like, is when people would want to point to the book and say, see, yep. we told you so all along. We told you so, and I, like I said, I get it. Like there's a certain amount of anger and resentment, and sort of like, and even people that are not angry or resentful, but have just come to terms with they think that the institutional church in this country is dying, and they think that that's a good thing, and that they would good riddance, really. We don't take. Ashley and I don't. Not only do we not take that particular stance, I would say that our stance is not really on either side of that fence as much as it is a much more pragmatic stance, which is to say, the institutional church has been with us for a long time in this country. It's going to be with us for a long time. The question is entirely about what sort of form it's going to take. The history of church in this country, when I say church, I'm meaning institutional church. I understand among the Duns that they yell at me all the time in a very friendly way. Church means wherever two or more are gathered. And I'm like, yes, I get that. But for the average American, what church means is, the building on the corner. And when I say church, I mean that building on the corner has been incredibly innovative over the last 200, 250, 300 years. It has faced challenges before. It has come through them. And I would say generally better than before the challenges came. So the way we think about this is as this moment where the Duns are this really important canary in the coal mine saying, look, we left already because we could. In the process of doing so, we made this pathway out of the institutional church that other people are starting to follow, that maybe didn't have as much resources or weren't as well positioned, but now they have like a model for how to do this. And the church is going to have to respond, and it will. Now, when I talk to people on the other side of that, when I talk to the pastors and they say, why should we care about these people? And I say, you don't have to. But what I do say is, like, you don't have to care about these people, but know that somebody will. And that if as this population grows, I don't mean that somebody will create a brick and mortar church that the Duns are going to come back to. I don't personally think that that's going to happen. And I don't really, if you were to really press me on the issue and get me to use the dreaded word should, which scientists tend to steer away from, I don't even think that that necessarily should happen. But what will happen, guaranteed, is that some really smart and thoughtful and caring person will come along, or rather a lot of smart and caring and thoughtful people will come along and figure out how to resource, engage, come alongside, support those people who have left the church. And it's going to expand our definition of what church means, and particularly what the role of pastor looks like in the coming 30 or 40 years. And if the people that are in the current brick and mortar churches don't want to be a part of that, don't worry. Somebody's going to do it.
Yeah. That is the biggest challenge is where do they go? Where do we go? We've been out for 6 months, have been back to, traditional institutional church 5 or 6 times in the last 6 months. And it's been challenging, after having come out and after having, run that machine, for so many years. And then, sort of going through a detoxification period, as I would describe it now. That's kind of what our family's going through. I would describe a detox, and maybe also
a lot of people do that language.
Well, yeah, deconstruction period too, just kind of going back to the scriptures afresh and looking at it and saying, what does the New Testament actually say? Now that I'm not getting paid to preach it, this is important, now that I'm not getting paid to take the text and deliver a message in such a way that gets people to get involved more or to give more money, now that that's not going on, and like parentheses, like it or not, that goes on more than pastors like to recognize. But now that it's not going on, looking back at the New Testament afresh and asking, what does the church actually do? Who are we? Where did we come from? How is it? How do we function? And as I look back and look at the birth of the church, it kind of was like really messy, and no real structure. The Holy Spirit breaks on the scene and fills people and does signs and wonders and miracles, and people are just rushing around in a euphoria of God's presence and all the stuff that's going on. Now, we move from Acts 2, to and it looks like at the end of Acts 2 there was some structure, some organization. Now they're gathering every day and they're worshiping and they're eating together and they're breaking bread and they're singing and they're giving, selling their possessions and giving to other people. So there's some activity, a burst of activity that looked like something particular. The danger, of course, is, and I think this is where the Duns come in, they're kind of tired of taking a result, taking a fruit, and trying to cram it into a structure when it grew out of something. The things that we seem to enjoy reading about in the book of Acts were a result of something happening because of what the Holy Spirit did. And so we take those results and we try to turn it into a system. We try to systematize it, standardize it, and turn it into a structure. And so then we get on that machine and pedal and bike and try thinking what we're doing is going to produce the same thing we read about in the book of Acts, but it doesn't. And we end up just getting utterly freaking exhausted at the end of it, especially leaders, pedaling that thing harder than anybody. And so now coming out of it, and deconstructing and saying, okay, how does this operate? How do you want to work, God? How does the Holy Spirit initiate and motivate and make things happen? And then what's next? What do we do? And so finding, I think, community, people who would categorize themselves as one of the Duns, finding community is important. Working with Wayne Jacobson has been very helpful. For those who haven't been able to read, he's got a great book called Finding Church. Probably one of the best books I have ever read. This was such a refreshing book, as well as Frank Viola's book on reimagining church. He wrote the book Pagan Christianity, which just really gave a great insight into the history, and then reimagining church kind of puts that back together. Probably my most favorite. And so as we look at reimagining church and finding church and trying to deconstruct it and put it back together, man, that is going to be a huge challenge ahead for the Duns. I don't know if the nuns even give a crap anymore, but the Duns certainly do, and I think there's a deep desire to want to follow Jesus, but just a question of, well, what the heck is next? What do we do now? And so With that, here's my little rant. With that, let me kind of move into chapter 6. I thought it was the most, not that everything else you didn't have to say was insightful. That chapter 6 was the most insightful because it was your attempt and Ashley's attempt to say, based on the problems that we've seen, based on the problems that came up from these interviews, here are some of our own suggestions. So first question, where did these thoughts come from in chapter 6? Some of the remedies and suggestions that came up, where did those come from? Is that out of your own head, or was it out of conversations you had with other people, or what?
Yeah, so I'm when we think about sociology, like what we're trying to do is uncover trends that occur and will be durable that we could replicate and find evidence for in one place that would show up in lots of other places, right? So religion for me, because it's the thing that I know, ends up being the sort of canvas on which I paint, or the sort of the place where I test out those ideas. But the content or the ideas that I'm most interested in are really organization ideas. So when I describe myself to my colleagues, I'll say, I'm an organization scholar who focuses on the sociology of religion. And so when you read through those things, people will say, well, there's nothing in here about church. I'm like, yeah, well, there's nothing in there about church. Churches haven't had a whole, I don't mean this to sound derogatory, but churches haven't had just a whole ton of insightful organizational innovations or ideas that have come out in the last few decades. They've been relatively static. Mega church came, which was the first attempt to put hardcore door-to-door marketing to what was inherently a social phenomenon, but that was 1977. And so since then it's been a little scarce. And so we turned to the other stuff that we said, well, surely the things that the church is dealing with are not the church isn't the only organization that's dealt with these kinds of things.
Right.
Clearly other organizations deal with high performing people that they would, talented workers that they would like to retain. And I don't mean to equate congregants to workers, but there are people in their organization that are talented that they would like to have working for their organization. And the church is no different in that respect. And so we thought, well, how do they deal with it? How do they handle that? And so that's what got us looking around to some of those other solutions that have been sort of vetted by the literature, have been shown to be effective in other places. It's probably the place in the book where we get the most editorial. It's like, if we were to put this in an academic article, that's probably that's probably the chapter that would have been cut first, because it's the research is there behind those methods, but it's not our research. We're just drawing on what other people have done, putting some puzzle pieces together and trying to build that bridge.
All right, so let me kind of throw this at you. So I'm reading and finishing up. I think a couple of nights ago, taking some notes. My wife is sitting beside me on the couch, and I get done reading chapter 6, and my initial remark was this. All right. Okay. Take it or leave it. My initial remark was, this feels like a bunch of Band-Aids on a very wounded and broken institution. I mean, how would you respond to that?
So I would say that I totally understand that, especially coming from someone who's self-describing as a done and in the middle of this sort of detox period, where I think that it is certainly well within your right, and obviously it's your experience to say, like, this thing is broken, and clearly was broken for you at some level. We heard a lot of that, and we kept trying to remind ourselves that even by the most wildly optimistic, and I would say overly optimistic projections by Barna and Kinnaman, we're talking like 30% of the church. I think that number, well, our survey is the survey results are gonna come out here soon. It's gonna show it's less than that, but it's not. It's still a substantial number. But regardless, church is working. The way church is being done now works for, let's say, like 80% of the people in it at some level. And there's no reason, I would say, you may have good theological reason, and other people may have good theological reasons for saying that we should blow it up. But organizationally, our position was you don't need to blow up what's working for the 80% just to pursue the 20%. We strongly feel that you can do both. And so what I understand why they look like Band-Aids to you, and I would say, you know, and you know this probably, if you were to actually think about how to put any of those things we talk about in practice at a church, they don't feel like Band-Aids. They feel like revolutions inside your walls. Yeah. And so we really wanted to offer some things where it's like, okay, look, if you care about this, here are some things that you can do to start in this general direction. And I'll be honest, like that, some of that comes from group, you know, they have we have a really good relationship with them. They clearly have a long history of working within the institutional walls of the church. And they said, like, we know this market, we know how to make things happen in this area. But I've never seen people inside of an organization more committed to turning their organization than the people that we've been working with at Group. Tom and the rest of them, this is his passion project. He firmly believes that this is an issue that needs to be dealt with, and from an organization that started, I think, before I was born, 1977 or so, been around a long time. He could just sort of coast and ride this thing out, and I think there's a lot of integrity in what they've done with When God Left the Building, and by supporting this book and developing other resources in this area. So we weren't at all sort of put off by that request of thinking out loud a little bit of what this might look like if we were to try and do some things organizationally. And when I talk to pastors about them, they don't feel like they're Band-Aids.
They don't. Okay. Yeah. And I wouldn't think they would, because, you know, that's the challenge when you're in the system. Yeah. There's a temptation to always be looking for the next helpful thing. And I think, in my opinion, and you know, a lot of others would share it as well, and that's all it is just an opinion. But media, our culture, entertainment, the publishing industry, I mean, it's all geared in order to sell books, to sell materials, to sell ideas, to get the next biggest thing. And one of the things I think that I've grown weary of is the tendency among pastors, not all of them, but many of them, to kind of bite down on those things, to chase after them so quickly, thinking, you know, I got to get more young people in my church, or I got to keep the ones who are coming, or we want to reach out to this segment or that segment. And so we go after the next, you know, seminar or conference or book or DVD series or whatever, in an attempt to try to accomplish some of those goals. And so when I look at some of them, you know, for instance, on page 116, you said you talk about the principle of inviting participation with limits. So I think that's one of the things there is, as you begin to unpack what that looks like, inviting people to come in, inviting people to take charge, giving people a piece of the budget, giving people some room to grow. But then it was interesting because, you know, immediately, you know, I felt the institutional arm come up when we use the word limit, because now the question is, well, who's controlling the limits? I know as a pastor and as an elder once, well, we felt it was our job, you know, to sort of shepherd and lead and control these limits, because we don't want things getting out of hand. And so then I think that's one of the challenges, is that the institution, you know, by very virtue, it built into its DNA is the concept that someone has to be at the top leading and telling everybody else what to do. And so that's one of the challenges I found, you know, with the participation. I'm looking at participation with hardly any limits. The only limits that we see, you know, in the New Testament generally were people who were screwing up the gospel. You know, here's what Jesus did, but we still want you to go and get circumcised. You know, here's what Jesus did, but we still want you to celebrate these special days. You know, and so those were the limits. But otherwise, it was like, man, just go for it. Sell whatever the heck you want to sell to give away, and go where you want to go to minister. And so anyway, that was one of the things. So my question is, you know, your suggestion about inviting participation with limits kind of assumes a fundamental underlying presupposition that there are people who should be controlling things. So there's my toss out. What are your thoughts on it?
So I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have is when we think about organizations, it's like we say organization, but we mean person. So even like in what you just said to me, you said it presumes that there are people that should be in charge, or a person who should be in charge of setting those limits. And I would I would say no. I don't think that that's true. I think a process should be in charge. or that you should have a system of making these kinds of decisions. People, it's just too much it's too much power to give to people who are invariably going to make mistakes, and they, to try to have to explain themselves. But that's sort of like, that's sort of like an aside and aside and aside. And I can hear the echo in my head of the Duns who would say, "Oh, you just said system, you just said process," and they would sort of, come back to me with that. And I would say, look, like, I don't think that for the people who've already been through this and they're on the other side and they consider themselves Duns, this chapter's not for them, right? It's really not. I don't think they're coming back. Like, we didn't write a manual for churches to be able to get the Duns back. if anything, in chapter 6, what we tried to do was say, like, stop behaving so poorly. In the result will be that fewer people probably will leave. And that you'll create more opportunities for people to be able to live out their calling inside of the church. That may be something that occurs, but really we're just saying, like, be better as an institution, not as a person. Because I'll tell you, I mean, this, like, we talked to so many pastors, and as a group, they're well-intentioned, they're authentic, they care. They've taken on often tremendous amount of personal debt and sacrifice to be able to do the job that they're doing. So I don't doubt the integrity of pastors across the board. I doubt the integrity of the sort of systems that they're often left to work within. And we wanted to provide some changes to that system.
Yeah. To what extent, as a sociologist, do you think that theology plays in sort of helping leaders in churches construct their systems? I mean, you say that, think of organizations, it shouldn't be people in charge, should be a process. But to what extent, do you think personally that, or let's just kind of talk about this for a minute, about theology playing a role in constructing that process?
So again, like, back to the sort of social scientist pragmatist in me almost says, like, it's a moot point. If you would like to take a really hard line theological position that says that only a particular kind of person with a particular kind of gift can be in charge, then, great. It's not going to work out for you in the long run. Like, it's just, and it may work out for a few people here and there. I don't, we talk in terms of trends, but generally speaking, the churches that are durable in this country are the ones who more or less reflect mainstream society. And so, it's no surprise that it doesn't mean that they concede or that they cave or that they, blow with the winds. What it means is that they recognize that they're embedded in a culture, and they let that culture be as that culture is always the vehicle that is the message that they're trying to get across about Jesus Christ. In this case, they use the tools that they have available to them. So that's the sociological take. If you would like to not pay attention to the culture that you're in, fine. That's totally your, that's great. It's like I said, chances are, if you were asking me to bet all of my savings and my house and my child's education fund, I'm not betting on you to make it. You know what I mean? Like, Godspeed and all of that, but I'm not betting on you. What I'm betting on are the people who are on the other side of that, because I feel like that message comes with is one that can resonate more. Personally, like, you've already our cards are on the table here. I don't think that this influences the book necessarily, but especially with regards to gender, like, I was not going to treat my wife as an equal 6 days and 23 hours out of the week, and then go to church for 1 hour and be like, okay, now we're going to put that aside.
That's right. Yeah.
And that was clearly the relationship that we had. It's the one that I wanted. It's the one that she wanted. And so it was only natural that our, the church that we went to was going to expand.
Okay. And so right there, how, what biblical data or information, if any, came to inform your decision to see your wife, in that role?
Yeah, well, so the biblical data would have probably been her saying, "We're not getting married if you think I'm." I would say that there are things that you can find by study and reading that I'm really nervous about picking out lines of scripture, because I know where that gets us.
Yep.
When we read the gospel, the central message that comes across to us is the message of love, and it's a message of love for everybody, not for any person more than another. And that's one of the things that that we have always tried to remind ourselves of. And when I think about, when I pray about, when I listen to God work in my life, there's for me, and we'll get to that in a second, but I don't understand that in any other way than equality. And so that meant that we weren't really interested in a place that had a real charismatic leader. I love Jeff, the pastor at the church that I go to, but he is not what anybody would consider to be charismatic. So we weren't really interested in going into a sort of cult of personality thing or cult of position either. And so that was a big take for us, because it's rooted in that way that we understand the gospel. And I think more than anything, we trust that if we've got it wrong, we trust in a graceful and forgiving God. And if we've got it wrong, then we've got it wrong.
Yeah. Man, I love that humility and I love that openness. Moving on, let's see. We've got a few questions here that have come in, so let me throw these. We've got one from it looks like Dan's face, Dan Daly. So we'll throw this out. Love Dan. Data aside, Dan says, I'm curious about Josh's personal feelings about what's going on. What does he think is happening? Any thoughts on what the end game is? And maybe you could, kind of. Weave in my question I had for you on, what do you hope the results are for the next 3 or 4 years?
Well, I'm really glad we're doing this interview and that it's going to go on YouTube, and I'm glad we finally got the technical stuff worked out. But I was bummed that I don't get to see Dan and chat with Dan. We might have to do that some other time, because he's been on Facebook and other places doing some things that have really sort of broadened my understanding. And so thank you, Dan, for that.
I wish we also had James Paul. He couldn't be with us. He's got a small group thing going on tonight, and I wish he could have been here as well. He's another pretty influential one.
Absolutely, yeah. And we talked with James back. Ashley and I both have chatted with him back in the winter. I think that what we're seeing here is, and I've talked about this in other places, but it's important, I think, and worth reiterating, that this is an institutional disengagement problem, not a church problem. The church didn't make this by itself, but it certainly contributed to this trend. So when we look across society broadly, we see people are less likely to vote, they're less likely to run for political office, they express less trust in their religious leaders and their education leaders and their universities, et cetera, across the board, right? People have been disengaging from civic life now at a pretty steady rate for about the last 15 or 20 years. And it's finally catching up to the church. And I think that's largely what we're seeing. I don't think that something happened in the last, say, 5 or 10 years that caused a whole bunch of people to say, I love everything else in my life, but I'm tired of the church. That's just, the sociologist, instinctively doesn't think that could be true. Right. And the data tell us that it's not true. And so it requires then that we think differently about what the institution does and what it can look like. I don't know what that could be. So that's the extent of my crystal ball. Right, is to say, at the very least, is to say, this isn't just your problem. And I think that that's really important, because it means that we can start understanding the issue the right way. So it's not about getting a better pastor. It's not about getting a better praise band. It's not about reading the latest statistics on what millennials want and trying to give millennials what they want, et cetera. It's about understanding what's going on across the board. I don't think it's a generational issue, at least certainly not from our data. It's an era thing. People are less likely to own homes. They're waiting longer to get their cars. It's a whole new world. And the church needs to adapt to that kind of a world if it wants to continue to remain a vibrant institution in our society. Which, now here's where you hear me say this, which I think it should do. The church plays an important role in our country. Or at least it has historically. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the institutional church has been at the forefront of, racial reconciliation or, women's suffrage or any of those things. But they haven't been real far behind the leaders either. And the ability to take those ideas that are sort of bubbling up and provide some organization and some impulse for those kinds of things, that's an important role that the church plays in our country. And I would argue that it needs to continue to play that role in our country. What we would like for the book to do is to is to really be the place that sort of creates the tent for these conversations. So somebody said this the other day, and I just tweeted it out, that it was in the AM radio podcast, said, if we're going to extend this, if we're going to use this metaphor of refugees, then we would like to think of our church, the way that they're doing church. I'm not familiar with exactly how they're doing it, but they said, we would like to think of it as a refugee camp. Come and pitch your tent with us and let's hang out. And I love that idea of having having this. If the book can become that refugee camp, it's temporary. It's a place where we can hang out. It's a space that, a metaphorical space where we can come together. And I feel like, if I can sort of hold the hand of pastors on one side and duns on the other, and we can be the conduit where people can listen to each other respectfully, then I think that we can begin to think about how, as people who are ultimately after the same thing, how they can be supportive of one another. Because I think that ultimately at the end, both groups will be better off with each other than without each other.
So I'm going to take it that Dan's happy with the answer to your question, or else he'll hop in here.
Please do.
Yeah, we have one other user, Chris Fillingham, friend of mine from Athens, Georgia. He's asking, do any of your studies deal with younger kids and their thoughts on the issue of the Duns? For instance, 13 to 21-year-olds.
Yeah. So when you go through university studies, the easiest thing to get approved is 18 and over. And since nobody was doing work in this area, we went for the real low-hanging fruit. I'll be honest, we weren't going to wait months and months and months for the IRB to come back to us and say, okay, you can talk to people under 18. But I will say this. So while we don't have anybody who's under 18 in our study, we were surprised that the average age was so low, and still until we started digging into why the kinds of decisions that people make, which is that the Duns are not typically people that go to church, have a bad experience, and disengage. They're committed people. Everything else about their profile says they're super into this, right? So usually they go to church, they have a bad experience, they switch churches, they go to a different church. And even then they have a bad experience, they go to a different church until finally they accumulate enough bad experiences and they say something like, the data of my life tells me that this is not a me problem. We keep trying to change our hearts and we keep trying to conform and fit in, but we keep running into the same roadblocks, and it's not a me problem, it's a church problem for them. And we get a fair amount of pushback on that idea from some hardliners. I would say it's a relatively hardline minority position in the church that says, if you kept getting frustrated, you're the problem.
Right.
So, and I understand a certain amount of that, but I think it certainly explains the age issue. That one of our hypotheses was that this would be a millennial thing, and it just didn't. It's not a millennial thing. I think it's an era thing, not a generation thing. Yeah,
I like the way you described that, because that was one of the aha moments I had around October, November last year. That after being involved in 7 churches, and of course my kids in tow behind everywhere we go. There's this constant, at least the circles that I ran in before, a constant attention and focus on intense discipleship. You need to do this stuff. You need to listen to your leaders. You need to let us help you, with the things that are wrong in your life. And of course, I know that they mean well. I don't think sometimes, and this is me speaking as one, it's really difficult to determine meaning well and just having a problem wanting to tell people what to do. But it occurred to me last October, November, after all of these different events, and seeing, and I told my wife that there are 2 common denominators in all of these churches. The first one is that I have been there. I was there, and all of my I had all my baggage in tow, and each bag was filled, I'm sure, with wounds and pains and grenades and various things to make those grenades go off while you're there. That's there. I'm the key. I'm the problem. But and that's what I carried with me at every church. And then finally it dawned on me, wait, there's another side of the problem as well. Something about the church is broken, and not all of them, that's just, I want to be really clear up front and say, I don't believe that every church, every institutional or traditional church is really systemically broken. I think that there is a personality trait involved in pastors and leaders who struggle with these kinds of things, and I think that there's almost a DNA within a denomination or a church planting movement in and of itself. Somebody is at the helm, kind of giving direction, and it's trickling down, and it creates a certain culture in which people see things a certain way and treat people a certain way. And so all of that kind of combines and converges together to form a context or environment that many times does feel abusive. It feels like the church, the institutional church, is really, as some people have experienced it, is largely, if at all, completely incapable of helping people unpack their baggage, receive them in the love of Jesus for who they are and where they're at, stop the incessant attempt to try to fix and to try to make people conform to certain things. And so, yeah, you're right. It's a twofold problem. Everywhere that person goes, they're the problem. Yeah. But everywhere they go, most of the time, there's an institutional, traditional church problem that's creating a context that causes things to malfunction. And I think, a lot of kids have felt that way too before, talking even to my oldest too, monitoring our progress as we detox and deconstruct, and even hearing some of their comments as well, that, it seems like we've always been involved in places where people are just trying to fix us. That was the term that my 16-year-old described. Always trying to fix me. My oldest one kind of saying the same thing. Always trying to tell me what to do. Nothing wrong with that. Jesus told us what to do. But yep. It's funny that in the institutional environment, it doesn't tend to be. It's funny in the circles I am. Discipleship is kind of robbed. Actually, it's kind of raped. To be honest, we use the banner of discipleship, but then we don't actually teach people to do the stuff Jesus told them to do. We don't actually open the scriptures and say, here's what Jesus said. We reframe discipleship in terms of just doing, what we tell you to do and what we need you to do. And so, yeah, things like that just constantly make it break all the time. And, who knows what God's going to do. I've enjoyed Wayne Jacobson's approach to just letting the Holy Spirit lead you to places where you find new life. And I think, I don't think there's any right or wrong necessary. I'm never going to stand up and tell somebody who's in a traditional church, shame on you, you ought to get out of there. I heard one couple describe it several months ago. The institutional church is the whore of Babylon. It's the beast of Revelation. Like, I don't think that's true, because there's a lot of people who love it. That's a little over the top. I'm never going to tell people to leave, but I'm going to tell people, what? Don't be afraid to ask hard questions. And I guess if who are watching now or will watch later, you don't have to be afraid. You don't have to be afraid at all of asking hard questions, and you need to also be prepared that asking hard questions does come with consequences, and you just got to kind of buckle in for those and prepare yourself. I think a lot of times. Some advice for those who are, I've had many people contact me who are on the verge of being done, and I've just tried to encourage them. You don't need to leave yet. You need to listen to the Holy Spirit. You do need to ask hard questions, but you need to know what's coming when you do. And I'm not trying to paint a context or a picture of doom and gloom, but in the end, the bottom line is we do have a brain. God gave us the ability to think for ourselves, and it is okay to ask hard questions, but you just got to know. You're going to create ripples when you do. So don't get huffy, get your drawers in a wad and leave and go around and get nasty and slander and get bitter and take a bunch of people with you. Just understand, we're all human beings, and we're all broken people bumping up against each other, breaking each other even more. And, for some of the duns, they're tired of getting broken. But there are those, I think, who can stay within it and be a real force for change. So, well, I don't see any more questions coming through. You got any last words you want to throw at us, Josh?
Yeah, I would say that, what we try to get across is that this is not a book that could have been written, 20 or 25 years ago. It's time. It's probably time for the institutional church to change, but that's not new. there's always been times the institutional church needed to change. We're just suggesting that maybe the things that worked in 1985 don't work in 2015. I don't know much else that I don't walk around and listen to a Walkman. For those of you who are younger than me, a Walkman is a thing that you put a cassette tape into. It was about 3 times the size of your phone or so, right? So I don't listen to music that way anymore. It's more, that says more than just about form. Like, this is not an issue of just shrinking your Walkman into a smaller form. It's because the whole world has changed between 1985 and 2015. And so, yeah, it stands to reason that we should have different strategies, right? That we should have different forms for how we do religion. We have different forms for how we do everything else. I heard this thing the other day, which I don't think it would have struck me before this research, but it hit me. It's standard church language. You probably have used it and heard it without ever thinking twice about it. But I was visiting somebody, and we went to their church, and they said, "Come." It's at the end of their service, and they're talking about all the things that they have going on for the week. And they said, if you're new to our community, come and get plugged in. And I thought, oh wow, like, what a terrible metaphor. Like, this thing that has made so much sense to me for so long, all of a sudden didn't make sense anymore, because getting plugged into something means, like, you're not the thing that's good. We're the thing that's good. You need to come here and get plugged into what we're doing here. And I had the voices of the duns rattling around in my head that were all saying, like, no, we don't. The church needs to get plugged into what we're doing. And I thought, like, it's moving away from what was probably never perceived as a deficit model, never intended to be a deficit model from the beginning, and moving into this model where you're breathing life into the things that other people are doing. Maybe you would argue that that's narcissistic of people to think that the church should come on board with what they're doing and support them. But I think that there's a lot of room for life there too. And if anybody who gives the book a fair read, I hope that what comes across, what I think comes across, is that we're not asking you to turn over all the dollars in your church to the people who are doing every crazy idea that they can think of. We're just suggesting that you can create a lot more life in your church by funneling things out, at least in some part, than trying to funnel things in, which has been the model for so long.
Yeah, and that many people seem to complain in some of the interviews that the institution seem to exist in order to serve itself.
That's right.
Just creating that slow implosion that can just churn people out. Well, all right. Well, some fun things as we come in here for landing, and I do want to thank, by the way, Raul Mach. With the Numa review. This was partly Raul's idea. And
great. Thank you, Raul.
Raul's watching, yeah. So Raul asked if I'd review the book for Numa Review, which is an online Pentecostal theological journal. And I said, I'd love to. How about this? How about we do a video interview? And so we kind of batted that back and forth. And so this will also go on their website as well. And that will reach a whole different segment that I would dare say probably hasn't even heard of the book yet. And so we'll see an interesting reach there. But so appreciate that, Raul, and the guys at Numa Review up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So some fun things here as we come in for landing. Josh, what's your favorite movie?
Oh my goodness, my favorite movie has got to be Cool Hand Luke.
Oh yeah, okay. Why is that?
I just I love the story of somebody who's. It was sort of what carried me through my dissertation. I was an English major going into a sociology program, and it's just a single-minded determination that the sort of the system and the machine was not going to get the best of him no matter what, and that has always resonated with me.
You know who else I think didn't let the system get the best of them? Nacho Libre.
I do very much like Nacho Libre.
It's a favorite in our house, so we focus on that here. See, he didn't let the system control him. He, of course, I love that prayer scene where he's there praying with the candles, and thank you, Lord, that you give me all these skills, and why am I not able to get out? And is it because I'm focusing too much on my stretchy pants and my boots and all of the fame and the free creams and lotions? And so
there's too much truth there. I can't.
Okay, how about your favorite band?
My favorite band right now is actually an artist out of Idaho. His name is Josh Ritter.
Okay, all right. Have you ever heard of I think it's Sufjan Stevens?
Oh yeah, I can listen to upwards of 3 or 4 of his songs in a row before I get completely lost and figure out which track I'm on anymore.
I've enjoyed meandering my way around his stuff too. How about adult beverage? You got a favorite beer?
Oh my goodness, we're in microbrew heaven here in Colorado. Greeley is about 100,000 people. We have 4 microbreweries. We are just down the street from Fort Collins, which is the home of New Belgium and Odell's, and they're all over the Front Range. But my favorite one comes out of Lyons, Colorado. It would be Dale's Pale Ale.
Okay, awesome. We've got a microbrewery here in Woodstock, Georgia, called Reformation Brewery.
Oh yeah.
With their name right, Reformation, you can imagine what kind of guys run that. Proudly 5-point Calvinists. So we had some interesting conversations, but man, they have some great brew. Interesting fact about the Reformation and brew. You may already know this. Some people do, but Martin Luther had a stein with 10 ring fingers on each side, and legend has it, according to Christian History magazine years ago, that he would drink and he would exposit one of the 10 commandments, and when he could not exposit one of the 10 commandments coherently anymore, he knew he'd had too much to drink, and his wife would take it away. Because he did. His wife had a microbrewery in the basement of their home. So
well, sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's exciting. So last favorite thing to do with your family when you guys are out, favorite hobby, favorite vacation, whatever.
We moved to Colorado for a reason, and we're outside a lot. So my wife is a really good golfer. My 5-year-old is a pretty good golfer, and I pick up the rear and smack the ball around whenever we can. So we try to find, when we can get out, when the 3 of us can get out and play, it's a good day.
Man, well, unfortunately, we live in Georgia, and we like to be indoors this time of year.
I grew up in Texas. I'm familiar.
Oh, my gosh, it's brutal. So, well, man, thank you so much, brother. I really appreciate the time you shared tonight, and I really hope a lot of people are going to get some benefit out of this. I think this type of conversation is going to carry carry a lot of people further on the journey. It's going to help deepen the conversation, and hopefully, more than anything, it's going to help us have the kind of conversations that will stimulate us to try to find some deeper love for one another and some solutions while not choosing to die on any hills anymore. So, and I can't thank you enough for the work you've done, man. It just, the video doesn't do enough here. Thank yous don't do enough, but it's a massive life work that you've done at this early stage in your life. So thank you so much, brother.
Well, thank you. Those are really kind words. And if anybody has I appreciate the opportunity to talk. I tell people all the time that I like gathering the data, the analysis I like a little bit less. The writing part I abhor, but it all gets me to the part that I like best, which is that you get to then talk to people about the stuff. And as an academic, it's a real privilege. I mean, often talking to people about the stuff you've done means talking to 4 or 5 other people sometimes. And so this has been great that people have picked this up. We'll be traveling around. I'll try and keep the website updated about where I'm going for conferences and things. We've had people request that we come to Grand Rapids, so we'd love to come out to Grand Rapids, or I would. And if anybody is interested in pitching a little tent for a while and having a conversation, I'm not so inundated with email that I cannot respond with email. So you can find me at josh.packard@unco.edu. You can get us on our website at dchurch.net or on Twitter at dchurchamerica. So we're available. We want to have the conversation. We want to be a part of the dialogue, and we appreciate this opportunity.
On that note, as we depart, I think the D Church project is still going, and people can still call in and share their stories with either you or Ashley. Is that right?
Yeah. So we envision we've stopped active data collection. We'd love for people to share their stories with us, but at this point, the sort of data collection for something like this would be a little bit contaminated because the book has gotten so much attention. So we have no control anymore over how we're getting those stories. But we envision the D Church project as being much larger than just this book. So the album was a part of that. The soundtrack was a part of the overall D Church project. We're looking at what to do, what it might look like to think about. A devotional for the D Church, the short 2-week or 3-week, maybe Advent style devotional for people that are finding church hard to walk into during a really important time of the holy season for Christians. And if people want to be a part of that or help us think through what that might look like, we're totally open to those conversations. So, yeah, we imagine that this has a wide range of things that will live under this banner for a long time. Fantastic.
Well, thank you again, brother, and thanks to everybody who hung in here for this long. And if you got any further questions, you heard Josh. You can also visit joshpackard.com, I believe, right?
Yep, that's my personal website. Yeah.
Yep, and you can also be friends with him on Facebook. And also, I think your tweet handle is @DChurchAmerica.
That's right.
Yep. So, well, good. Reach out, and thank you again, everybody. And we'll close this out now. So everybody have a great night.
Thanks, Rob.